They thought I wouldn't notice. They thought I wouldn't fight back, and they definitely thought I wouldn't tear it down. But when an HOA decided they could build an entire house on land they didn't own, without permission, without warning, and without consequences, they triggered a chain reaction that cost them $1.2 million. What started as a quiet land grab turned into a legal nightmare, a demolished house, and a lesson every HOA wishes they'd learned soon. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from a letter, a phone call, or a warning sign posted on my land. It came from tire tracks. Fresh, deep grooves cut through the dirt road that led to the far edge of my property, tracks that hadn't been there the last time I checked. That land had been untouched for months, sitting quietly the way rural land is supposed to. No construction permits had been pulled, no surveys had been conducted, no one had contacted me. Yet the ground told a different story. At first, I assumed it was a neighbor cutting through, maybe a contractor who got lost. That kind of thing happens when you own acreage near a growing subdivision. But as I followed the tracks deeper, the sound of machinery reached me before the sight did. A low, mechanical hum, steady and confident, as if whoever was working there believed they had every right to be. Then I saw it. Framing lumber stood upright where open land used to be. Concrete had been poured, a foundation had been set, and at the center of it all, unmistakably real and undeniably permanent, sat the skeleton of a house. A house on my land. Not a shed, not a fence, not a temporary structure, a full residential build, the kind of project that doesn't happen by accident. The land itself told the story. Stakes had been driven into the ground, survey markers were visible, freshly planted, but placed incorrectly. Anyone familiar with property lines could tell immediately that something was off. They weren't just a few feet over. The structure was completely inside my parcel, crossing a boundary that had been legally established decades earlier. The shock quickly gave way to disbelief. Then disbelief hardened into anger. This wasn't an innocent mistake by a private individual. This was organized, coordinated, funded. Contractors were moving with purpose. Materials were delivered on schedule. Someone had approved this, someone had signed off on it, and someone had decided that my land was theirs to use. The answer became obvious the moment I recognized the logo on the construction vehicles. The HOA, the same homeowners association that managed the rapidly expanding development bordering my property. The same HOA that had been aggressively adding new homes to increase dues revenue. The same HOA that had pushed for rezoning approvals and infrastructure expansion in recent years. They had taken it upon themselves to build a house on land they did not own. At first, I expected this to resolve quickly. A simple correction, a stop work order, a teardown handled quietly to avoid embarrassment. That assumption didn't survive the next few weeks. Instead of stopping, construction accelerated. Walls went up, roofing materials arrived, utilities were trenched into the ground. Each day that passed felt deliberate, as if speed itself was being used as a weapon. The unspoken strategy was clear. Finish the house, then deal with the problem later. Create a situation so complicated, so expensive, that undoing it would seem unreasonable. The HOA operated on a familiar playbook. Overwhelm first, intimidate second, exhaust the opposition until they give in. But this time, they miscalculated. The land had been in my possession for years, purchased outright, properly surveyed, recorded, and documented. Every inch of it was mapped, every boundary verified. I didn't inherit confusion or ambiguous lines. I owned certainty. What I didn't own was patience for being ignored. Formal notices were sent, legal documentation was delivered, proof of ownership was provided, survey maps were attached. None of it slowed the build, none of it triggered a pause. The HOA continued as if the evidence didn't exist. And that was when I realized this wasn't negligence, it was arrogance. The HOA believed that by the time the house was finished, I'd be boxed into compliance. They believed that courts would favor the completed structure over the landowner. They believed the cost of fighting them would scare me into selling that portion of my land at a discount, quietly legitimizing their mistake. They believed wrong. The house reached near completion within months. Siding installed, driveway poured, landscaping started. It stood there like a declaration, a physical statement that my property rights were optional. But the law doesn't work on confidence. It works on facts. And the facts were brutal. The HOA had no deed, no easement, no agreement, no permission, no legal standing whatsoever. They had built a house entirely on land they did not own, without consent, without negotiation, and without even the courtesy of acknowledging the owner. That house wasn't a home. It was a liability. And as I stood on the edge of my property, looking at a structure that should never have existed, the next step became inevitable. Not because of anger, not because of revenge, but because allowing it to stand would set a precedent I could never undo. The decision was made quietly, deliberately, and with absolute certainty. The house was coming down, and the HOA was about to learn just how.
The demolition didn't begin with chaos. It began with paperwork. Every action taken from that point forward followed a strict legal framework. Notices were issued, deadlines were documented, final warnings were delivered with proof of receipt. The HOA was given every opportunity to correct their mistake, remove the structure, and restore the land at their own expense. They chose silence. That silence sealed their fate. Once the final deadline expired, the situation changed. The house was no longer just an illegal structure. It was an unlawful encroachment. And under the law, unlawful structures don't get sympathy. They get removed. Heavy equipment arrived early in the morning. The same way the house had appeared without warning, its end came swiftly and methodically. Walls came down, roof beams collapsed inward, concrete was broken apart and hauled away. The land was reclaimed piece by piece until nothing remained but disturbed soil and scattered debris. The house that had once stood as an arrogant monument to HOA overreach was reduced to rubble. And that was only the beginning. Because tearing it down solved only one problem. The financial consequences were still waiting. The HOA had assumed the worst-case scenario would be embarrassment. They were wrong. The real cost came from what they destroyed in the process: my land, my time, and my legal rights. Environmental damage had to be assessed. Soil compaction studies were conducted. Unauthorized utility trenches had compromised drainage patterns. The restoration costs alone were massive. Then came the legal claims: trespass, property damage, unjust enrichment, willful negligence. Each claim stacked on the next, forming a case that grew heavier with every document submitted. The HOA's internal communications became evidence. Emails revealed they knew about the boundary dispute early on. Memos showed they chose to proceed anyway, believing the landowner would fold. That single assumption changed everything. What might have been resolved quietly for a fraction of the cost turned into a full-scale legal reckoning. Insurance carriers distanced themselves, board members scrambled, legal defenses collapsed under the weight of their own documentation. The numbers escalated quickly. Demolition costs, restoration costs, legal fees, punitive damages, lost land use. Each category added another zero. And because the actions were deemed willful, not accidental, the court had little patience for excuses. The final judgment landed like a hammer. $1.2 million. Not as a negotiation, not as a settlement discount, as a direct consequence. The HOA was ordered to pay for everything, every inch of land disturbed, every hour wasted, every decision that ignored clear boundaries and legal reality. The amount reflected not just damage, but deterrence, a message sent clearly and publicly. HOAs do not get to rewrite property lines. They do not get to gamble with land they don't own, and they do not get rewarded for building first and asking permission never. The fallout was immediate. Board members resigned. Special assessments were issued to homeowners who had no idea their association had taken such a reckless gamble. Lawsuits followed. Reputations collapsed. The development slowed to a crawl under scrutiny it had never faced before. As for the land, it was restored, regraded, reclaimed. Survey markers were reinforced, boundaries reaffirmed. The silence returned, heavier than before, carrying the weight of a lesson learned the hard way. The empty space where the house once stood became more powerful than the structure it ever was. It stood as proof that ownership still matters, that arrogance has limits, and that even organizations built on authority can crumble when they ignore the law. The HOA thought they could build over resistance. Instead, they built their own.
This wasn't just about a house. It was about power, entitlement, and the dangerous belief that someone else's land is fair game if you move fast enough. The HOA thought they could outbuild the truth and outspend the law. Instead, they lost the house, the money, and their credibility. And the empty land they left behind now stands as a reminder that property rights don't disappear just because someone else ignores them. If this story proves anything, it's that when authority crosses the line, accountability eventually shows up with a wrecking ball and a 7-figure bill.